1/3 of America's school children now have restricted or no access to concepts related to race, racism, and gender along the lines of critical race theory. According to a new study conducted by researchers at UCLA and UC San Diego, almost 18 million public school children in nearly 900 school districts, that's 35% of all K through 12 students across the nation, have been impacted by concerted local efforts and a barrage of laws and policies that are directed to restrict or even ban the teaching of critical race theory. Surveying almost 300 educators and 20 equity officers and analyzing 10,000 news articles between September 2020 and August 2021 about CRT, the Conflict Campaign report also shows many educators are now afraid to discuss issues around race or racism or to promote the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They also worry that this current climate will further curtail students' motivation to freely exchange ideas and views. Joining me now to discuss critical race theory is Kimi Katiti. She is an interdisciplinary artist and a video essayist. Kimi, thank you so much for joining me. You have a YouTube video with almost 500,000 views where you say you hate critical race theory. Summarize for me, why do you hate it?
Well, I'll be very brief. I was kind of taken in by critical social justice pedagogy during my time in college. That turned my worldview very essentialist. So I believed that my opportunities in life were limited to my identity markers. Because I am a Black woman, I'm not going to have opportunities. I am not going to be presented with opportunities for promotion. And so that really lessened my worldview. Coming out of that, however, I began to realize true empowerment in knowing that there is hope for my future because I am embracing concepts such as forgiveness and healing, and critical social justice kind of produced an anger within me whenever I integrated microaggressions, for example.
So I'm a bit confused. What in critical race theory did you read that operates against forgiveness and healing, and what did you read that said that there's no opportunity for progress or for advancement on a job?
Yeah, absolutely. The whole entire critical pedagogy, just to be very broad, has been very detrimental for my own opportunities and my own outlook on life. Now, if you want to get specific,
no. But I'm asking what specifically you read that said that. I mean, I understand your position on how you reacted to it. But what I'm asking is, where does it say that? What did you read that said that? What can you name anything? Can you point to anything? I'm not asking you to point to a page number, but I'm saying in general, like what are the concepts? What are the ideas that you read that suggested any of these things?
Yeah, so I can specifically cite Ibrahim Kendi, for example, who believes that present-day discrimination is necessary to undo discrimination of the past. Now, I kind of walked in that for a little bit, and that's just a citation, but again, I want to make it clear that the broad concepts like microaggressions, for example, are what were fed into my worldview during my time in college.
What's a microaggression?
So,
what's a microaggression?
Pardon?
What's a microaggression? You said, you said you have issue with microaggression.
Yes. So I do believe microaggressions are real. I'm not out here to deny that. That's not what I'm talking about.
I need you to, what is a microaggression? You're saying?
Yes.
I'm asking you to define it. What is a microaggression?
A microaggression in my case would be, for example, someone not passing me over for an opportunity at work, for example, and believing that that's probably due to my race. Or if we can narrow it down to a more everyday situation, people sitting next to me, scooting over or choosing other seating, and maybe preferring to be with a group of white students or white people, white coworkers. To me, that's my understanding of microaggressions. Is that the same for you or no?
Okay, so no, because I've read this work carefully. So let me back up and address all the things you said. I want to make sure I heard you out first. So first of all, I asked you to say something in Ibram Kendi. I'm sorry, I asked you to name something in critical race theory that that speaks to a lack of forgiveness or healing.
Yes.
And you point to Ibram Kendi, which and he doesn't speak against forgiveness and healing. In fact, he's actually done a great deal of work talking about forgiveness and healing. Ibram Kendi's not a critical race theorist. He doesn't identify as a critical race theory. His work's not in a critical race theory canon. It's not part of the critical race tradition. He's a historian who talks about sort of who talks
Totally.
about race across time. So right, so you're saying totally, which means you're
Yeah.
agreeing with me. But when I asked you to name a critical
Yeah,
race
I
theorist
definitely.
or a critical race a piece, when you asked you to name a piece of critical race theory that talked about that operated against these interests, you pointed to someone who's not a critical race theorist, and then you said that he argues that discrimination now is necessary to argue to fight discrimination or to redress discrimination in the past. Even if I concede that that's what he's arguing, and it's not what he's arguing, that's a misreading. But even if he were arguing that, his argument would be that black people and that the people most marginalized should get special benefits now. If you as a black person were marginalized, if you as a black woman were marginalized at the intersection of race and gender, then you would actually be the person most likely to make that argument. If anything, a white guy could make the argument that Ibram Kendi or this argument will operate against his interests. But you said that critical race theory made you think that your opportunities were less than, when in fact, based on what you said, your future is more bright based on the premise that the people who caught the most hell are getting the most back. So this whole argument here, and then the microaggression part, the idea of getting lastly, just to address the last point you said, this idea of not getting a job because of your race is not a microaggression. That, a structural inequality or structural deprivation of resources is not a microaggression. Microaggressions refer to things that happen at the micro-interactional level as opposed to the macro-interactional level. And so I would ask you, and then we can move on to one more thing in the minute we have left. I just want to ask you one more question, and then I want you to respond to everything. Can you name one actual critical race theory book that you've read?
Yes, I have read Stefancic and Delgado, An Introduction to Critical Race Theory. And actually, in the introduction of, I have referenced and have cited on all my videos in the resources, there is an introduction that states the definition of microaggressions. And you're actually echoing everything that I just said, of course, because I'm on this show to be slam dunked on. A lot of those concepts will get convoluted, but if you are enacting present day discrimination, you are living through a lens of vengeance, of justification. However, we can't be, now when it comes to children, and want to talk about that study, if you want to reference it, you don't want people to grow up with that race essentialist lens where we can't read through the semantics. Children can't read through that nuance, and they will embrace this idea of vengeance, vengefulness, having an attitude of retribution. And that's kind of at the heart of this matter. We can play games of if CRT is in schools or not, but hey, this is what I believe. This is my opinion, and I believe it's valid, and a lot of people have the same sentiments, feel the same way.
Well, I haven't said anything about CRT being in or out of schools. That feels like a straw man. But let's take a break, and we'll come back after the break, right? and keep. I didn't say that at all. No, I didn't say that at all. It
was referenced.
I got to take a break. I'll be right back. Study? No, I'm saying I didn't say that. I'm not arguing that point. We can have that conversation, but I haven't had it yet. So let me take a break because I have to, and then we'll come back and we'll continue the conversation. Everybody, stay right here. More Black News Tonight coming up. We continue where we left off, discussing issues around critical race theory. Kimmy, so let's pick up where we left off. Kimi Katiti is with me. So just to be clear, you're not here to be dunked on. We're here to have an engaged conversation. I've asked questions and I've responded. You're saying that I've sort of disregarded what you said, and you were actually in agreement. I'm saying we're not in agreement. When I asked you, the reason I asked you what these points was not to say gotcha or catch you, but to understand where we're operating from. So when you say we're saying the same thing, you said that an example of a microaggression, just as one example, is you not getting a job because you're black. And what I said is that's actually not how microaggression is defined. You mentioned that I asked you what you'd read because I want to know where you saw that. And you mentioned Delgado and Stefanovich, which is it's an introductory textbook, and they don't define it that way either. What they actually define microaggression as is sort of small interactions that would be largely unnoticed by members of the interaction, right? And certainly of the person of the person engaged. And being denied a job because you're black wouldn't qualify. So I'm saying that's just objectively wrong. That's a different issue. But I don't want to get hemmed up in that. I just want to be clear that I wasn't being pedantic. Yes, but I didn't disagree with the second example. I disagree with the first example because it was wrong, and so I'm just pointing that out. But thank you. So, but to move forward, just because I want to educate the audience properly. But moving more largely to the bigger question here, you say that CRT doesn't leave any space to forgive and forget. Data consistently shows that students of color are actually more likely to be disciplined than their white peers. They're more likely to receive harsher punishments for the same infractions in school. They're also less likely to be placed in advanced classes. Would you agree with that data?
I have not been keen on that data, very detailed, so I don't really think I'm informed enough to present an opinion on that right now.
That's fair. If that were true, just assume, indulge me for a minute, and assume that the mounds of empirical data that show this over the last 5, 6, 7 decades is true. If it is true, would it not be important for teachers and administrators to be cognizant of the way that race operates in school, perhaps unknowingly to them?
I would entertain that. I don't think that's off the table. However, I think in John McWhorter's book Woke Racism, he does tackle a broad spectrum of issues, but also the outcome of disciplining or withholding discipline from students who happen to be students of color, and how the negative outcomes of that have been. So I don't know if that's the specific case, the same case that was referenced. But if we approach these issues with critical social justice pedagogy, critical social justice approaches, we end up harming students of color in the end, because
what would be an example
again,
of
in the
that?
words of John McWhorter,
Just so I understand what you're
Black people are viewed.
Just so I understand, I want to get your opinion, not John. John's been on the show. I love John. He's a friend. But John made a polemic text, right? He wasn't data driven. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily helpful to say, well, John said it too. That would be that's what we call a logical fallacy, right? An appeal to authority. What I'm asking is something slightly different. I'm saying, can you explain? You said if we take a critical social justice pedagogy approach, that's a lot of words, right? None of which are critical race theory. But even if it were, what does that mean? What does that look like? Because what I pointed to is the fact that, for example, Black kids are over-disciplined in school. They're suspended more than their white counterparts for the same offenses. They get in trouble more. All the data shows is what I'm saying is, you're saying if we take the wrong approach, it makes the problem worse. Fine. What does the wrong approach look like based on you?
The wrong approach would be to, for example, limit discipline, for example, when it comes to students of color, and say that we're just going to allow students to exist without any discipline because that disadvantages students of color, and then having those numbers increase. Numbers of students.
Has anyone ever argued that?
I don't know.
Do you know of anyone who's argued? What I'm saying is, do you know of any program, any curriculum, any people who are actually arguing, for example, we shouldn't discipline Black kids just for social justice reasons? No. The argument here, and feel free to, who?
Action was taken for a group of students. Now, I don't have the information in front of me, but action was taken to have a certain approach for those issues.
What approach? What's the certain approach?
The approach of not disciplining students who happen to be students of color for fear that that's feeding into the disadvantage that is seen in that data.
Right. So if you look at actually the sort of social justice approach to school discipline, it doesn't argue that. I've read all of it, and if you can name one that contradicts what I'm saying, I'll concede the point. But what it actually says is that we should look to alternatives to suspensions, right? Not just for Black kids, but for students across the board, because they're not an effective preventative measure, and they tend to ruin kids' educational outcomes. No one's arguing that schools shouldn't discipline students. That's never been the argument. For example, if you cut school every day and I punish you by suspending you from school for cutting school, that's not a smart punishment. Right? That's literally telling you don't have to come to school because you cut school. The argument is we should do something different that would actually solve the problem. And so the idea that somehow we're trying to ignore our responsibility to children or not teach them is simply untrue. The idea that we're not supposed to, that children aren't learning the values of forgiveness or justice by pointing out race is not true at all. I do dispute the idea that CRT is being taught in schools, but I do think that the CRT conversation, as the data is showing, is making it hard for people, regardless of whether we think CRT is being taught in school, it's making it hard for people to talk about race at all. And it's making it hard for people to have race-targeted or race-specific policies, but it's also making it hard to talk about race in very basic ways in elementary school textbooks and readers and in social studies class and history in high school, all of these things. So I want to give you the last word here. What does a proper curriculum or approach to school more broadly look like that considers race, if at all?
An approach would be one that doesn't dismiss the efforts of people that were, say, activists in apartheid South Africa or in the civil rights era, and try to modify their words or modify their teachings to fit this sort of third wave of anti-racism, again, with my logical fallacy of appealing to authority. I would suggest that we integrate maybe a view of both and maybe introduce those concepts a little later in life, perhaps high school or college, where people are able to really critically dive into these texts, maybe on their own investigate the sources, rather than make it very simplistic and divide the world based in black and white or white privilege and blackness, and allow students to be more of the age where they're ready to wrestle with these topics because they are heavy.
They are heavy. I've never met the text or the suggestions you're talking about, but I'd love to read them. Hopefully you can send them to me. Hopefully you can come back to the show and we can discuss those too.
Absolutely.
Kimi, thank you so much for joining me on Black News Tonight.